startups, established companies that are innovating in Ireland today. And I'm going to talk to you today about ICON as a clinical research organisation and provide an example to you of where we've innovated in our sphere and how the regulations and legislative framework within which we have to work sometimes limits and challenges the development of innovation, which should by no means prevent it. We have two colleagues speaking on the main stage not long after me on the digital patient, and they'll talk about the ICON role in the development and use of wearables in clinical research. Again, a fascinating area and one that's growing considerably all the time. Great. Can everybody hear me okay? No? Is that any better? Okay. My God, I'll have to eat it, I think. Great. So what we're going to cover today in the short 15 minutes is who is ICON, for those of you who don't know who we are. A brief introduction to the regulation of clinical trials, which forms the background for us certainly in product innovation. And process innovation indeed. And the example I've chosen for you today is informed consent, a central part of a clinical trial and an innovation from ICON to make the informed consent process of the clinical trial an electronic process, and how we were challenged in terms of whether that process would or would not conform with the regulatory environment within which we have to work. And as a global company, that regulatory environment changes depending on where you are. And again, I'm sure many of you in the room have found the same challenge as you innovate. And then some final thoughts on how to deal with some of the challenges and constraints presented by regulations and legislation in the area of innovation. So in terms of who ICON are a clinical research organisation to the pharmaceutical, biotech and medical device industries. We started from very humble beginnings in Dundrum in 1990 under the leadership of John Climax and Roman Lamb. There were only 5 staff at that time and a very modest turnover. We're 26 years old this year, so we have now a staff of more than 12,000 people based all over the world, a significant number in Europe and the States, and about 2,000 in the Asia-Pac region as well. And that facilitates, obviously, our ability as a research organisation to manage trials on behalf of the industry all over the world. What exactly is a clinical research organisation? Well, we provide support services in the drug development process to the pharmaceutical industry, biotech industry and medical device industry. And that support can happen at the preclinical stage, at the clinical study stage or clinical trial stage, whether that's phase 1, phase 2 or phase 3, phase 1 being first in man. And then through to the process of getting your product on the market, and then on into your obligations in the post-marketing sphere to continue to monitor both the safety and efficacy of your product throughout its life cycle on the market. And some of the service areas that ICON offer include early phase services for establishment of clinical trial services in phases 1 to 3, commercialization and outcomes. We have a significant laboratory service. But what we're going to focus on today are some of the work of our technology team, our innovation team, in the execution of the ICON mission to accelerate the development of drugs and save lives, and to be a partner of choice for the industry in terms of the products we develop and the processes we offer. In terms of the regulation of clinical trials, and obviously this is very much a whistle-stop tour, but really the predominant piece of guidance or legislation around how clinical trials are managed from beginning to end, including their design, their conduct, their recording and reporting of the results, is a document or a piece of legislation called the International Conference of Harmonisation Good Clinical Practice, or ICH GCP. And it's designed to ensure 2 main things. 1, that the patients or trial subjects are protected throughout the process, and 2, that the data generated through the clinical trial process can be stood over at the end of the day and can support a licensing application. ICH-GCP was developed in 1996 when clinical trials were predominantly paper, and many times they still are paper, and so a lot of the guidance in ICH-GCP was designed to deal with paper-based systems. And in 2016, many of the systems we're using in the conduct of a clinical trial are no longer paper, or at least that's where we want to be. We want to be in a space where we're no longer relying on paper. There is a new draft update to ICH-GCP, and there is significant hope that that guidance would include significant changes to the recommendations around electronic media, the use of electronic media. There isn't a great deal in there at the moment, but what it does do is recognise the existence of new technologies in the conduct of a clinical trial. Other considerations from a regulatory perspective, I guess, for any one working in the drug development space are elements of good manufacturing practice or good distribution practice, particularly manufacturing and distribution of clinical trial medicines or medical devices, but particularly for the example I'm going to talk you through just now, good automated manufacturing practice or computer systems validation, something that's become a cornerstone of the regulation of medicines, and all of the processes and procedures, the ones that we just spoke about now, mass spectrometry, all of those types of innovations must be subject to computer systems validation to be considered appropriate for use in a clinical development program. Data protection, another really topical one. Data protection is something that we all saw in the news there before Christmas when Facebook were taken to the European Court for allowing the movement of data from the European Union into the US, and only just recently there has been a new agreement published by the European Commission in relation to data transfer between Europe and the States. But it's a big consideration when you have patient identifiable data, even in an electronic environment. Medical devices, I'm not going to speak particularly about medical devices today. As I say, my colleagues are talking about wearables, very much considered medical devices. And obviously the regulatory landscape around medical devices is particularly important if you're developing product innovations in that sphere. So what's informed consent? Informed consent is a regulatory process integral to every clinical trial, whereby a trial participant, or patient, actively signs up to participate in the trial with full knowledge of what the trial is designed to do, what benefits they can expect to receive from participation in that trial, what are the risks for participating in that trial. And historically it's been very much a paper-based document, sometimes 15, 20 pages long, very technical, often very difficult to understand actually for patients. And I don't know if any of you have ever participated in a clinical trial, but very much the reality of the consenting process is that the patient says to their treating healthcare professional, well, would you do it? And the answer is yes or no, and the patient signs up to be in the trial. And the idea of the form is to show that the patient has actively signed up to be in the trial, and that, according to ICH-GCP, has to be a written, signed and dated document, so that there has to be evidence that can be looked at later on, available to a regulator, to show that the patient knew what they were getting into and were fully informed about the trial. It's required by law. It requires ethical approval in terms of its content, but it does include data that can identify the patient. It includes the patient's name. So what did ICON do to try and improve the process of informed consent? We developed a system that would capture the informed consent process electronically, improve patient comprehension by allowing the patient to see a multimedia version of what was the previous informed consent form, capture the signature of the patient electronically, and store all of the informed consent documentation. So the first consent, and then at any stage during the trial where the patient needed to be reconsented, where something had changed, there was new information they needed to be informed about, and all of that must be documented and inspectable by a regulatory authority at any point in time. And this process also allows them for a full audit trail. What date did the patient sign? What date did the investigator sign, their healthcare professional? So the idea not only improves the process for the patient, but improves regulatory compliance. And you might ask why. Well, a lot of the issues identified at regulatory inspection around GCP or clinical trial practice revolve around the poor informed consent processes. Wrong versions of the form signed, no date, wrong date, name entered incorrectly, and so on. So we've developed a 2-module informed consent or e-consent tool. The first is an e-consent viewer that allows the patient to look at all of the data available on the trial in a structured way. I don't know if you can actually see this, it's really quite small, but the information at the top of the viewer provides the patient with some information around the trial. There's a possibility to add multimedia type informative videos and so on. And then there's 2 buttons at the bottom that allow the patient to confirm that they either understand or don't understand and would like to ask a question. At the end of the process, you'll see that a number of the numbers at the bottom, which are the pages in the e-viewer, have question marks on them. And the idea is that the investigator, when they meet the patient in person to consent them into the trial, that they will focus on those areas that are of concern to the patient and answer their questions appropriately. Provided the patient is then willing to partake in the trial, the document is signed electronically using any of these devices, so your mobile phone, your iPhone, your iPad, or a Wacom pad, a stylus pen like the one you might be asked occasionally to sign away your bank credit with. And then all of that, as I say, is stored in a fully auditable module that allows both the investigator to know exactly what stage the consenting process is at with the patients that have signed up for the trial, and inspection obviously by clinical trial monitors and regulatory authorities. So it sounds like a good idea, looks like a good idea, but can it work? Can we make it work in a regulatory environment? And I guess the answer to that is yes, we can. Can we make it work in every regulatory environment? Is every regulator ready for it? Maybe not. And I suppose being aware of all of those things allows you to take your innovation, take your new technology, and bring it to the markets that can accept it, bring it to the environments that will use it. So we look at some of the legislation that might impact a technology like this. ICH, GCP, and local clinical trial requirements in whatever region you're in. Good automated manufacturing practice or computer systems validation, data protection, e-signatures, an interesting one. E-signatures is something that around which there is legislation mainly focused on e-commerce, banking, but it doesn't say actively that clinical trials or clinical research is excluded. So it was another area of legislation that we had to look at and review and determine whether it impacted our piece of technology or not. And I guess the good news is that it has been used at the moment. We have our first clinical trial using our electronic e-consent running in the US at the moment. The Europeans are a little more conservative, I would say, in terms of their acceptance of this as regulators. But we're very hopeful that this will be the way to the future, particularly when you think that most hospitals now, most clinical settings are moving towards electronic health records. Nobody wants to have pieces of paper, and everybody wants clinical trials to be run in a way that allows them to be much more efficient, for patients to participating in them to be much better informed, and to really actively sign up to taking part in a clinical trial. Some final thoughts. I don't believe that legislation or regulatory requirements should ever prevent innovation. But I do think that you need to plan early and you need to know the legislative environment that you're working in. Obviously, for a lot of the products that I'm seeing out here, you're looking at medical device legislation. Engage appropriate experts in the regulatory field, and including regulators if you can get them to talk to you. And I know that's not always an easy thing, but if you can, it's definitely worth doing. It's not always easy to innovate in a regulatory environment, but it's definitely possible, and it's definitely harder retrospectively. Thank you very much.